The storm hit harder than Nathan expected. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow came down in thick sheets, turning the dense forest into a whiteout. He had barely made it back to his cabin before the roads became completely impassable. He had planned on spending the weekend alone, just him, a fire, and the quiet peace of the mountains. But when he opened the door to grab more firewood, he saw her. A woman, shivering violently, wrapped in a thin coat, struggling to walk through the knee-deep snow. "Hey," Nathan called out, stepping onto the porch. "You okay?" The woman looked up, her lips a pale shade of blue. "My car, it broke down a mile back," she said through chattering teeth. "I was trying to find shelter." Nathan didn't hesitate. "Come inside," he said, already moving toward her. "You'll freeze out here." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. He led her inside, shutting the door against the storm. The warmth of the cabin engulfed them immediately, but she was still shaking. "Sit by the fire," he instructed, grabbing a thick blanket from the couch and wrapping it around her. She huddled into it, her hands trembling as they reached toward the flames. Nathan crouched beside her. "You need dry clothes, I'll get you something." She looked up at him then, her eyes wide and filled with exhaustion. "Thank you. I didn't think I was going to make it." "You're safe now," he assured her. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a sweatshirt and flannel pants. "They'll be big on you, but at least they're warm." She took them with a grateful nod and disappeared into the bathroom. When she returned, her damp hair was pulled over one shoulder, and the oversized clothes made her look smaller than she already was. Nathan handed her a steaming mug of tea. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said, wrapping her hands around the cup. "Sophie Carter. Nathan Hayes," he introduced himself. "You were driving through the mountains alone." She let out a tired laugh. "Yeah, brilliant idea, right?" He arched an eyebrow. "Not the best timing," she sighed. "I was on my way to visit my sister. She just had a baby, but I guess I didn't check the weather forecast carefully enough." Nathan nodded. "You won't be going anywhere until this storm lets up." "Roads are completely buried." Sophie looked toward the window, biting her lip. "How long do you think that'll be?" "Could be a day, could be two," he admitted. "You're welcome to stay here until it's safe to leave." She met his gaze, something cautious yet grateful in her expression. "Are you sure?" He gave a half smile. "I'm not going to send you back into a blizzard, Sophie." She exhaled, sinking deeper into the couch. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said simply. For the next few minutes, they sat in silence, the crackling fire filling the cabin with warmth. Nathan tried not to stare at her, but something about Sophie pulled at him. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her eyes, the way she curled into the blanket like she was trying to make herself small. He shook the thought away. She was a stranded traveler, nothing more. But as the storm raged on outside, Nathan had the strangest feeling letting her stay might change everything. The storm didn't relent. If anything, it grew fiercer overnight, the wind howling against the cabin walls like a living thing. Nathan had woken up several times, listening to the relentless force outside, wondering how long they'd be snowed in. By morning, the world was buried under several feet of snow. The roads were invisible, the trees bent under the weight of ice. There was no way Sophie was going anywhere. Nathan found her already awake, standing by the window, wrapped in the blanket he had given her the night before. She turned when she heard him, offering a small, uncertain smile. "Still snowed in?" she asked. He nodded. "We're not going anywhere for a while," she sighed, her breath fogging up the glass. "Guess I should get comfortable then." Nathan glanced at the fire, still burning low from the night before. "You hungry?" Sophie hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. I think I am." He set to work in the kitchen, pulling out eggs and bread from the small pantry. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage breakfast. Sophie hovered near the counter, watching him, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "You live up here alone?" she asked. Nathan cracked an egg into a pan. "Not full time." "I come here when I need to get away." She tilted her head. "Get away from what?" He hesitated. That was a loaded question. Life, he said finally. Sophie didn't press. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat, tucking her legs under herself. I get that, he glanced at her. Yeah, she nodded. Sometimes you just need space, to think. To breathe. Nathan studied her for a moment before turning back to the stove. There was something in her voice, something wistful. Like she wasn't just agreeing with him, like she understood it in a way most people didn't. A few minutes later, he placed a plate in front of her, scrambled eggs, toast, and a few slices of apple. Nothing fancy, but enough to fill them up. Sophie looked down at the food, then back up at him. You really are saving my life here, he smirked. It's just breakfast. She shook her head. No. It's more than that. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional roar of wind outside. Nathan found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way her shoulders relaxed just a little with each bite, the way the color was slowly returning to her face. After breakfast, Sophie insisted on helping clean up. Nathan didn't argue. He wasn't used to company, but there was something about her presence that felt easy, natural. So, she said, drying a plate, what do people do for fun when they're trapped in a cabin during a snowstorm? Nathan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Depends. Some people read. Some people chop wood. Some people go stir crazy. She smirked. Great, I'll try to avoid that last one. Nathan considered her for a moment before nodding toward the fireplace. I've got a deck of cards. You play. Only if you're ready to lose, she teased. He arched an eyebrow. Big talk. You'll see, she said, following him to the couch. They played for hours. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, but soon, it became something else. Sophie laughed when she won, groaned when she lost, and Nathan found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. At one point, she leaned back, stretching her arms over her head. Okay, I admit it, I underestimated you. Told you, Nathan said, shuffling the deck. Sophie shook her head, studying him. You don't talk much, do you? He glanced up. I talk. She gave him a look. Not about yourself. Nathan hesitated. He wasn't used to people prying, but Sophie wasn't prying, not really. She was just watching him, curious in a way that didn't feel invasive. What do you want to know? He asked. She shrugged. Anything, everything. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I was in the military, got out a few years ago, needed space after that. Sophie's expression softened. That's why you come here. Yeah, she nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Then she looked down at the cards between them. I guess we both ended up here for a reason. Nathan wasn't sure what she meant by that. But before he could ask, the fire crackled louder, sending a burst of warmth through the room, and Sophie smiled. Your cabin's nice, she murmured. He glanced around. He had never thought much about it, just a place to escape, to be alone. But right now, with Sophie sitting across from him, wrapped in his clothes, her hair still slightly damp from the night before. For the first time, his cabin didn't feel lonely, and that realization hit him harder than he expected. The second day of the storm stretched long and slow, the outside world swallowed by endless white. Nathan had seen bad snowstorms before, but this was something else. The roads wouldn't be clear for at least another day, maybe longer. Sophie didn't complain. She adapted, leaning into the quiet rhythm of the cabin, her presence settling into his space like she had always belonged there. It was unsettling how easily she fit into his world. They spent the morning in shared silence. Nathan chopped wood outside while Sophie curled up by the fireplace, absorbed in a book she had found on his shelf. When he walked back in, shaking off the cold, she barely looked up. You don't strike me as the poetry type, she commented, flipping a page. Nathan raised an eyebrow, setting the firewood down. And what type do I strike you as? She smirked. The brooding, ex-military type who probably reads survival manuals and crime novels. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I like poetry. Sophie shut the book, running her fingers over the worn cover. It's good. This one? She hesitated, then read aloud. I loved you first, but afterwards your love outsoared mine as the hedge larks did the larks. Nathan swallowed. He knew that poem. She looked up. You know Christina Rossetti, he exhaled, shaking his head. My mom used to read it. Sophie's expression softened. She had good taste. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, filling the space between them with warmth, and Nathan felt something shift in the air. The way she looked at him, like she saw something more than just the man he presented to the world, it unsettled him. He cleared his throat. You hungry? She studied him for a second longer, then smiled. Starving. Nathan set to work in the kitchen, pulling out supplies while Sophie hovered nearby. She had started doing that, lingering close whenever he cooked, offering to help even when he insisted he had it handled. So, she said, leaning against the counter, when this storm clears up, what's the first thing you'll do? He glanced at her. You mean after I dig my truck out of the snow? She laughed. Yes. After that, he considered it, cracking an egg into the pan. Probably head back to town, make sure everything's still standing. Sophie tilted her head. You live in town, Nathan nodded. Yeah. Small place, about 20 miles from here. She looked surprised. So this isn't just some remote escape. This is your life. Something like that. Sophie fell quiet, tracing patterns on the counter with her fingertips. I don't know what I'll do. Nathan glanced over. What do you mean? She exhaled, shaking her head. I was supposed to visit my sister, but I don't know. After this, going back to my life feels, she cut herself off, biting her lip. Nathan turned off the stove, setting the food on 2 plates. Feels what? She hesitated, then met his eyes. Like maybe I don't want to go back. Something tightened in his chest. He didn't ask why. He had seen it in her from the moment she arrived, that quiet sadness she tried to hide, the way she flinched at certain questions. Whatever she was running from, she wasn't ready to say it out loud. So instead of pressing, he handed her a plate and said, Then don't. Sophie blinked. What? He shrugged. If you don't want to go back, don't. She let out a breathless laugh. It's not that simple. Why not? She hesitated, gripping the edge of the counter. Because people are expecting me. Because I have a job, a life. Nathan took a step closer. A life you don't want. Sophie's lips parted, but no words came. He didn't know what made him say it. He barely knew her. But in the past 2 days, he had seen more of her than most people probably ever did. And right now, standing in his kitchen, wrapped in his clothes, she looked like someone on the edge of a decision she wasn't ready to make. Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Eat before it gets cold. Sophie nodded slowly, taking her plate. They ate in silence, but the words lingered between them, heavy and unspoken. By the time the sun began to set, the wind had died down and the snow had stopped falling. The worst of the storm had passed. Nathan found Sophie outside, standing on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. The snow stretched out in endless waves, untouched and glistening under the fading light. He leaned against the railing beside her. First clear night in days. She nodded. It's beautiful. Nathan glanced at her, at the way the cold turned her cheeks pink, at the quiet wonder in her eyes. Yeah, he murmured. It is. She turned toward him then, something unreadable in her expression. Nathan, he swallowed. Yeah, her lips parted like she was about to say something important. But instead she just smiled, small and tired. Thank you. Nathan exhaled, something in his chest twisting painfully. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to thank him. That he didn't do any of this expecting gratitude. That somehow, in ways he didn't understand, he needed her here just as much as she needed shelter. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he just nodded. Anytime. And as the night stretched on, as Sophie stood beside him in the freezing air, Nathan realized the storm had passed, but something else had taken its place. Something he wasn't sure he knew how to stop. By morning, the silence was different. Less like the quiet of isolation, more like the weight of something unspoken. Nathan knew the roads would be clearing soon. He had checked the radio, listened for updates. The worst of the storm had passed, and by afternoon, crews would be working their way through the mountain roads. Sophie would be leaving soon. He wasn't sure why that thought sat so heavily in his chest. She was just a stranded traveler, someone who had happened upon his cabin by chance. But after 2 days of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the warmth of her presence filling his space, the idea of her walking out of his life felt wrong. Nathan wasn't a man given to sentiment. He had built his life around solitude, around the idea that attachments only led to pain. But something about Sophie had slipped past his defenses before he even realized it was happening. Now, standing in the kitchen, watching her stir a cup of tea absent-mindedly, he felt the weight of their impending goodbye settle into his bones. "You're quiet this morning," she murmured, not looking up. Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Just thinking." Sophie glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Dangerous habit," he smirked but said nothing. She set the spoon down, wrapping her hands around the mug. "The roads will be clear soon, won't they?" He nodded. "Yeah. Maybe by late afternoon." She looked down at her tea, her fingers tightening around the ceramic. "Right." The word was soft, almost reluctant. Nathan leaned against the counter, watching her. "You don't sound too excited about that." Sophie let out a breathless laugh. I have a place to be. People expecting me." "But," she hesitated, then finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "But I don't know if I want to go back." Nathan's chest tightened. He should tell her that, of course, she had to go back. That this was temporary. That whatever she was feeling right now, the quiet, the stillness, the connection between them, it wouldn't last outside these walls. But he couldn't bring himself to say it. Instead, he just held her gaze, waiting. Sophie sighed, setting her mug down. "Before the storm, before I got stuck out here, I was running." Nathan's jaw tightened. "From what?" She let out a humorless laugh. "From everything. From a job that drains the life out of me. From a relationship that ended months ago but still lingers like a ghost. From expectations that don't feel like mine anymore." Nathan stayed silent, letting her speak. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "I thought if I could just get away for a little while, I'd figure it out. But then my car broke down and I ended up here." She looked up at him, something raw in her expression. "And now, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel lost." Nathan's breath caught. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have affected him the way it did. But it did. Because he understood. Because he knew what it was like to feel untethered, to search for something without knowing what it was. And because the idea of her finding that something with him, of her staying, was a thought he couldn't ignore any longer. "Sophie," a knock at the door cut him off. Nathan stiffened, his instincts flaring to life. No one ever came up this far unless they had a reason. Sophie looked at him, her brows furrowed. "Who?" He shook his head, moving toward the door. He opened it cautiously, and standing on the porch, bundled against the cold, was a man Nathan didn't recognize. "Afternoon," the man said, his breath visible in the crisp air. "I work with the road crew. We've started clearing the main road. Should be passable within the next couple hours." Nathan nodded, his grip tightening on the doorframe. "Appreciate the update." The man nodded back, tipping his hat before turning and trudging back through the snow. Nathan shut the door, exhaling slowly. When he turned, Sophie was watching him, her expression unreadable. "So," she murmured. "That's it," he swallowed. "Guess so." The words felt hollow. Sophie nodded slowly, then turned back toward the kitchen, but something in her movements was hesitant, uncertain. Nathan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still, to not reach for her. But every part of him was screaming not to let her walk away. Not yet. Nathan didn't move as Sophie turned away, but his entire body tensed with the weight of unsaid words. The knowledge that in just a few hours she would be gone, and that should have been fine. He had spent years keeping people at a distance, convincing himself it was better that way. But Sophie had slipped past his walls so effortlessly, so completely, that the thought of her leaving felt like something breaking inside him. Sophie busied herself in the kitchen, rinsing out her half-finished cup of tea, but her movements were stiff, mechanical. Like she was trying to distract herself. Like she was trying not to feel it too. Nathan exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair before finally forcing himself to speak. "You don't have to go." The words were out before he could stop them, hanging in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. Sophie's hands froze on the counter. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Nathan, we both know I can't stay." "Why?" His voice was rough, raw. "Because people are expecting you. Because your life is waiting for you. What if that's not the life you want anymore?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, her throat working like she was struggling to find the words. He took a step closer. "You told me you don't know if you want to go back, that, for the first time in a long time, you don't feel lost." "What if that means something?" Sophie let out a shaky breath. "Nathan." "Stay," he said, his voice lower now, more desperate. "Stay for a little while. Just until you figure it out." She shook her head, her eyes shining. "And then what?" Her voice wavered. "What happens when the snow melts and real life comes rushing back in?" Nathan clenched his jaw. "Then we deal with it. Together." The word slipped out before he could stop it, but he didn't regret it, because that was the truth of it, wasn't it? It wasn't just about keeping her here for a few more days. He wanted her, not just in his cabin, in his life. Sophie sucked in a breath, looking at him like he had just shattered whatever fragile barrier she had been holding up between them. "Nathan." She whispered, shaking her head, but she didn't step back. He took another step forward, closing the space between them. "Tell me I'm wrong." She didn't. She couldn't. Because she felt it too. The pull. The connection. The thing neither of them had asked for but now couldn't seem to ignore. Her breath hitched as his hand lifted, brushing against her cheek, his fingers barely grazing her skin. "Sophie," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. She closed her eyes for half a second, like she was bracing herself. Then she opened them again, and whatever battle had been raging inside her, it was over. She surged forward, her hands grabbing the front of his shirt as she pressed her lips to his. Nathan inhaled sharply, his arms wrapping around her without hesitation, pulling her against him like she belonged there. Because she did. The kiss wasn't soft, it wasn't careful. It was desperate, like they were making up for lost time, like they both knew this moment had been inevitable from the very start. Sophie's hands slid up to his shoulders, gripping him tightly as he deepened the kiss, pouring every unspoken word into it. "Stay, choose this, choose me." When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, neither willing to let go just yet. Sophie's fingers curled into his shirt, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this." Nathan exhaled, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "Then we figure it out together." She let out a shaky laugh. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," he admitted. "But nothing worth having ever is." Sophie searched his face, and for the first time since she had arrived, she looked at peace, like she had finally stopped running. Finally stopped fighting what they both knew was real. Finally started choosing what she wanted instead of what was expected of her. Her lips parted, and this time when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Okay," Nathan's heart pounded. "Okay," she nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'll stay." And just like that, the storm wasn't what had changed everything. They were. The snow had started to melt. It wasn't immediate, but the shift was undeniable, the way the thick sheets of white had begun to recede, the once impassable roads slowly revealing the dirt and gravel beneath. The icicles hanging from the porch dripped steadily, falling in rhythmic, deliberate drops. The world was thawing, and so was Sophie. Nathan watched her from the doorway, his shoulder resting against the frame as she stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't cold, he knew that. She was thinking. Processing. Deciding. The past few days had been unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He had lived in this cabin for years, had spent seasons watching storms come and go. But none of them had left a mark quite like this one. None of them had left her. Sophie turned slightly, her gaze catching his, and even from a distance, he could see the small smile playing on her lips. It was different from the smiles she had given him before, lighter, more certain. She had made her choice. Nathan stepped off the porch, crunching through the snow as he approached her. When he reached her side, she didn't look away. "It's clearing up fast," she murmured. He nodded. "Yeah." She took a slow breath. "I thought I'd feel different when it did. Like the moment the roads were clear, I'd have to leave." Nathan swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. "You don't." Sophie turned fully toward him then, her eyes searching his. "No," she agreed softly. "I don't." Something inside him eased just slightly. She reached for him first, her hands sliding over his arms, her fingers curling around the fabric of his sweater. "I spent so much time convincing myself I had to keep moving. That if I stopped, if I let myself feel something, I'd never know how to start again." Nathan's hands settled at her waist, his grip firm, grounding. "And now," she exhaled, her breath visible in the crisp air, "now I don't want to keep running." The words settled between them, warm and certain. Nathan lifted a hand, brushing his fingers against the side of her face, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You know what you want," Sophie nodded. "I do." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "I want this." Nathan's heart pounded, his arms tightening around her. "You," she whispered, "I want you." And then she kissed him. It was different from their first kiss, not desperate, not filled with uncertainty. This was soft, deliberate, filled with the kind of quiet promise that didn't need words. Nathan pulled her closer, his fingers splaying against the small of her back, holding her there like he had no intention of letting go. Because he didn't. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie rested her forehead against his, her hands still gripping his sweater. "I don't have it all figured out," she admitted. "But I know I want to figure it out here, with you." Nathan's throat tightened. "You sure?" She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Nathan, I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That was all he needed. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the moment, the certainty in her touch, the warmth of her body pressed against his. The storm had brought her here, but love was making her stay. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan wasn't alone, and he never would be again.